The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Brussels, its golden rays reflecting off the glass facades of the European quarter. Within these hallowed halls of power, decisions that shaped continents were made daily. Yet on this particular Tuesday afternoon, none of the seasoned diplomats, policy experts, or political veterans could have predicted that their carefully constructed world was about to be shattered by 90 seconds of raw, unvarnished truth. The European Council building stood majestically at the heart of the district, its neoclassical architecture a testament to centuries of European civilization. The structure itself seemed to whisper of power and tradition. Marble corridors that had witnessed countless negotiations, crystal chandeliers that had illuminated historic agreements, gold-gilded ceilings that had overseen the rise and fall of nations. 27 national flags hung with ceremonial precision along the walls, each representing a member state of what many considered the world's most sophisticated political union. Inside the main conference hall, preparations were underway for what was supposed to be a routine policy discussion. The mahogany table, polished to perfection, stretched across the room like a bridge between nations. Leather-bound folders were arranged with military precision at each seat, containing briefing documents, economic projections, and strategic assessments that would guide European policy toward Africa for the coming decade. At the head of this imposing table sat Helena Vanderberg, a woman who had dedicated her life to the art of diplomacy. At 60 years old, she was the embodiment of European intellectual elite, her silver hair styled with the kind of precision that spoke of morning routines unchanged for decades, her navy blue suit chosen not for fashion but for the authority it conveyed. Behind her wire-rimmed glasses, sharp blue eyes had observed 3 decades of international negotiations. Her credentials read like a diplomatic hall of fame. Harvard Law School graduate with highest honors, international relations doctorate from Oxford University, fluent in 5 languages, and author of 2 seminal works on European foreign policy. She had negotiated trade agreements worth billions, mediated conflicts that threatened regional stability, and earned the respect of world leaders from Washington to Beijing. In the corridors of Brussels, her word carried the weight of law. Vanderberg prided herself on her analytical mind and her ability to dissect complex geopolitical situations with surgical precision. She had built her reputation on being 3 steps ahead of her counterparts, anticipating their moves like a chess grandmaster. Her colleagues often joked that she could read a person's intentions before they themselves knew what they wanted. This afternoon she felt particularly confident. The agenda was straightforward, discussing the European Union's comprehensive strategy for African development and resource management. Around the table sat representatives from 27 nations, each bringing their own expertise and national interests to the discussion. There was Hans Müller from Germany, a former banker turned diplomat whose understanding of African mineral wealth was encyclopedic. Pierre Dubois from France brought decades of experience in Francophone Africa, his knowledge of regional politics unmatched among European circles. Marco Rossi from Italy had spent 15 years working on Mediterranean-African trade relationships. These were not novices, they were the cream of European diplomatic corps. The atmosphere was collegial, almost academic. Coffee cups steamed gently next to neat piles of documents. Tablets and smartphones lay ready to capture every detail of what was expected to be a productive but unremarkable afternoon. The only sounds were the quiet rustle of papers and the occasional murmur of conversation as delegates reviewed their briefing materials. At precisely 2:30 p.m., the double mahogany doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a force that seemed to disturb the very air in the room. The figure who entered defied every expectation, violated every protocol, and challenged every assumption about how such meetings were conducted. Ibrahim Traoré stood in the doorway like a man who belonged there, despite the obvious fact that he most certainly did not. His red beret sat at a perfect angle, a splash of defiant color against the muted tones of European formality. His military uniform, though impeccably pressed, bore the subtle patina of desert sand, a reminder that his office was not in some climate-controlled building, but in the heat and dust of West Africa. What struck the assembled diplomats most forcefully was his solitude. African leaders, when they visited Brussels, came with entourages. There would be advisors whispering in ears, interpreters ready to bridge language gaps, security personnel maintaining respectful but visible distances, and protocol officers ensuring every procedural detail was observed. Traoré had none of these. He was alone, carrying only the intangible but unmistakable weight of a continent on his shoulders. The hall fell into a silence so complete it seemed to absorb sound itself. 60 of Europe's finest diplomatic minds found themselves collectively holding their breath. This was unprecedented. In the carefully choreographed world of international relations, such spontaneous appearances simply didn't happen. Security protocols alone should have made this impossible. Yet here stood the president of Burkina Faso, uninvited, but undeniably present. Traoré's eyes swept the room with the methodical precision of a military officer assessing terrain. He took in every face, every expression, every subtle shift in posture. The curiosity was mutual. Here was a man in his early 40s who had risen from relative obscurity to lead his nation through a period of unprecedented change. His background was well known to intelligence services, but remained somewhat of an enigma to the diplomatic establishment. Military officer, economics graduate, and anti-corruption crusader, his resume was impressive but unconventional. Helena Vanderberg rose from her seat with the fluid motion of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. Her smile was calibrated to convey welcome while maintaining appropriate distance, a diplomatic skill honed over 3 decades. Yet beneath the professional courtesy, there was something else, a slight narrowing of the eyes that suggested she viewed this unexpected guest as an interesting but ultimately manageable disruption. "President Traoré," she said, her voice carrying the subtle authority of someone speaking in her domain, "your unexpected visit has certainly surprised us." The phrase was delivered with exquisite precision, acknowledging his presence while simultaneously highlighting its impropriety. "I certainly hope there's a serious reason for this sudden arrival." The implicit message was clear to everyone in the room. You are out of place, out of protocol, and quite possibly out of your depth. Traoré approached the table with measured steps, each footfall echoing in the acoustically perfect hall. His gait was neither hurried nor hesitant. It was the walk of a man who had decided on a course of action and would see it through regardless of consequences. As he moved closer to the table, the delegates could see details that humanized this unexpected intruder. Lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, calluses on his hands that suggested he was no stranger to physical work, and, most importantly, an unwavering gaze that met every pair of eyes without flinching. "Thank you, President Vanderberg," Traoré replied, in English that was not just fluent, but precisely articulated. His accent carried traces of his homeland, but his diction was that of someone who had studied not just the language, but the culture it represented. "The reason for my arrival is quite simple. I want to discuss cooperation with you." The word cooperation hung in the air like a key that might unlock doors or spring traps, depending on how it was used. Vanderberg's smile widened, transforming from diplomatic courtesy to something approaching anticipation. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the opportunity to demonstrate the vast difference between amateur-hour theatrics and professional diplomacy. She opened the file on her desk with deliberate ceremony, activated her tablet with practiced efficiency and adjusted her glasses with the confident air of a professor about to deliver a familiar but devastating lecture. Of course, President Traoré, our cooperation with Burkina Faso is indeed a matter that needs to be discussed. She paused, allowing the phrase to settle. Around the table, other delegates began to relax slightly. This was familiar territory, the careful dissection of an African nation's economic vulnerabilities, followed by the presentation of European solutions. The data I have here is quite comprehensive, Vanderberg continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering an objective analysis rather than a judgment. Your country's GDP contracted by 2.3% last year, while inflation has reached 12%, well above the regional average and certainly above sustainable levels for long-term growth. She looked up briefly to ensure her audience was following her reasoning. Your unemployment rate has climbed above 25%, which places enormous pressure on social stability and represents a significant waste of human capital. The statistics rolled off her tongue with the fluency of someone who had delivered similar presentations dozens of times before. This was the European approach at its finest, thorough, data-driven, and, ultimately, paternalistic. However, Vanderberg continued, her voice beginning to rise slightly to signal that she was approaching her main point, the most critical indicator is your external debt ratio, which has reached 47% of your GDP. These figures, I am afraid, demonstrate quite clearly the challenges of pursuing an independent economic policy without the structural support and institutional guidance that the European Union is uniquely positioned to provide. She paused dramatically, allowing the weight of these statistics to settle over the room like a blanket. Therefore, the development packages and structural reforms proposed by the European Union represent not just an opportunity, but frankly a necessity for sustainable growth and social stability. May I have a minute of your time? The words sliced through the silence with such unexpected force that several delegates actually startled in their seats. Traoré's voice remained calm, but there was something underneath it, not aggression, not anger, but an absolutely unshakable determination that seemed to fill the room. Vanderberg froze mid-sentence, her mouth slightly open, her prepared remarks suddenly seeming as fragile as soap bubbles. In 30 years of diplomatic negotiations, through heated debates in the United Nations, through crisis meetings that determined the fates of nations, no one had ever interrupted her like this. The breach of protocol was so complete, so audacious, that for a moment she couldn't process what had just happened. "Excuse me?" she stammered, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the shock underneath. "Just 1 minute," Traoré repeated, standing up with the fluid motion of someone accustomed to command. His posture was relaxed but alert, like a soldier who had learned to be comfortable in hostile territory. Vanderberg nodded slowly, her diplomatic training kicking in, even as her mind raced to understand what game was being played. What happened next would be analyzed and dissected by diplomatic scholars for years to come. Traoré began to walk slowly around the table, not pacing nervously, but moving with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that every gesture, every step, every pause would be remembered and interpreted. With each footfall, the sound of his boots on the polished floor echoed through the acoustically perfect hall, creating a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the collective heartbeat of 60 increasingly nervous diplomats. The sound was neither threatening nor deferential. It was simply present, undeniable, impossible to ignore. All eyes followed his movement. This was not standard diplomatic theater. Leaders didn't walk around conference tables during formal meetings. They sat in designated seats, spoke when recognized, and observed protocols that had been refined over centuries of international relations. Yet here was this man, this uninvited guest, transforming the entire dynamic of the room simply by moving through it. "The statistics you mentioned are really quite interesting," Traoré said, his voice carrying easily through the hall. His tone remained conversational, almost casual, as if he were discussing the weather rather than dismantling the fundamental assumptions underlying European-African relations. Particularly that 47% external debt ratio you highlighted. Several delegates exchanged glances. Where was this leading? "But I think we need to establish some context through comparison," Traoré said, stopping behind the Italian representative's chair. The man shifted uncomfortably, suddenly feeling like a specimen under examination rather than a participant in a policy discussion. "A comparison, yes." Traoré's voice carried a hint of something that might have been amusement, though his expression remained serious. "For example," he paused directly behind Marco Rossi, the Italian delegate, who suddenly found himself the unwilling focus of attention from around the entire table. Italy's external debt ratio currently stands at 155% of GDP. The number landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread throughout the room. Greece stands at over 200%, Portugal at 130%, Spain at 120%. Even Germany, arguably Europe's most robust economy, maintains an external debt ratio of approximately 65%. Each statistic was delivered with clinical precision, and with each number, the atmosphere in the room grew more tense. These were not accusations, they were simply facts, verifiable data points that every economist in the room knew to be accurate. Yet somehow presented in this context, they felt like accusations nonetheless. The hall had fallen into what could only be described as stunned silence. Diplomats who moments before had been confidently taking notes now sat with their pens motionless. The comfortable assumptions that had governed their approach to African policy were crumbling in real time. Traoré slowly moved to position himself directly in front of Vanderberg, close enough that she could see the determination burning in his dark eyes, far enough away that the gesture couldn't be interpreted as threatening. The positioning was perfect. He commanded the attention of the entire room while making it clear that this conversation was ultimately between the two of them. "So while you characterize us at 47% as incapable of pursuing independent economic policy," he said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made every word feel like it was being carved into stone, "you accept Italy at 155% as a respected G7 member." Vanderberg's face had begun to flush, a red creeping up from her collar that she couldn't control. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly as she searched for words that simply wouldn't come. All her years of diplomatic training, all her carefully honed skills at deflection and redirection seemed to have abandoned her in this moment. This is a completely different situation," she finally managed to stammer. "European economies have much more complex structures, more sophisticated financial instruments, deeper institutional frameworks." Complex. Traoré's lips curved into what might be charitably called a smile, though there was no warmth in it. "Or perhaps," Traoré continued, "the issue is simply a matter of perspective. What you describe as complexity is actually just a double standard, isn't it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that demanded an answer, but received only silence. Pierre Dubois, the French representative, attempted to salvage the situation with the kind of diplomatic intervention that might have worked in normal circumstances. President Traoré, these comparisons don't account for the fundamental differences in economic structures, the role of reserve currencies, the integration with global financial markets. I haven't finished yet, Traoré said without turning his head, his eyes still locked on Vanderberg. The interruption was delivered without heat, but with such absolute authority that Dubois fell silent immediately. President Vanderberg began this conversation with economic data. Allow me to continue in the same vein. Vanderberg was visibly struggling to regain her composure, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. I'm listening. What followed was a masterclass in economic warfare conducted not with weapons or sanctions, but with simple, undeniable mathematics. The amount of gold extracted from Burkina Faso over the past 20 years averages 45 tons annually. At current market values, this represents approximately $2.8 billion worth of raw material extracted from our soil each year. He paused to let the figure sink in. Several delegates were now frantically making notes, perhaps for the first time wondering about statistics they had never thought to calculate. The question becomes, how much of this gold is processed within Burkina Faso, adding value for our economy, creating jobs for our people, generating tax revenue for our government? Let me provide the answer. Zero. Precisely zero. All of it. Every single ounce is exported in raw form. The word zero seemed to echo in the acoustically perfect hall. By whom? Companies based in Europe, operating under agreements negotiated through institutions like this one, using legal frameworks developed to ensure maximum extraction with minimal local benefit. Vanderberg's hands had begun to tremble slightly, a movement so subtle that only those closest to her could observe it. What is the value of that same gold once it's processed into jewelry, electronics, or investment products? Approximately $8 billion annually. Where does the $5.2 billion difference go? The question was rhetorical, but it landed with the force of an accusation. Every person in the room knew the answer, but no one had ever heard it articulated so starkly, so unavoidably. Shall I continue with cotton? Without waiting for permission, Traoré pressed forward with the relentless logic of his argument. Burkina Faso produces approximately 700,000 tons of cotton annually, making us the second largest cotton producer on the African continent. Raw cotton trades at approximately $2 per kilogram on international markets. Hans Müller, the German representative, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew where this was heading, and he knew the numbers would be accurate. The average processed textile product, the shirts, dresses, and suits manufactured from our cotton, sells for approximately $25 per kilogram of raw material input, a 12-fold increase in value through processing. Traoré's voice remained steady, but there was an undertone of something that might have been sadness, or perhaps exhaustion, at the obviousness of what he was describing. I ask again, where is this processing conducted? This time he gestured toward the German delegate. In Lyon, in Milan, in Hamburg, in factories owned by European companies, employing European workers, paying European taxes, contributing to European economic growth. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow made his words more powerful than less. Our raw materials are harvested by our people, transported by your companies, processed by your workers, taxed by your governments, and then sold back to us at 10 times the original price. Vanderberg tried to stand up, perhaps to regain some measure of control over the situation, but her legs seemed unsteady. This is simply normal international trade, market economics, comparative advantage. For the first time since entering the room, Traoré's voice rose above its measured conversational tone. How is this different from the 19th century? The question exploded into the silence like a thunderclap. Back then, you also took our raw materials, processed them in your factories, and sold them back to us. The only difference is that now you call it cooperation instead of colonialism. The hall was engulfed in a silence so complete it seemed to absorb not just sound, but oxygen itself. No one appeared to be breathing. The comparison was so stark, so undeniably accurate, that it rendered meaningless every carefully crafted euphemism that had been used to describe these relationships for decades. But Traoré wasn't finished. More importantly, he said, his voice dropping back to that conversational tone that had proven so devastatingly effective. Why wasn't I invited to this meeting? Vanderberg's eyes widened as if she had been physically struck. What do you mean? Today, here, in this room. Traoré gestured around the magnificent hall with its 27 national flags and its 60 assembled experts. You are discussing a comprehensive cooperation strategy with Africa. You have prepared what I understand to be a 52-page report outlining your vision for Africa's next 20 years. He paused, letting the implication build. You are drawing roadmaps for our future, making policy decisions that will affect the lives of over 1 billion people, determining the economic destiny of an entire continent. Another pause. And there is not a single African leader among you. The observation was so obvious, so fundamentally undeniable, that it seemed impossible that no one had ever thought to question it before. Yet there it was, hanging in the air like an indictment that could not be answered. Traoré leaned forward, placing his hands on the polished mahogany table that had witnessed so many historic decisions. How can you make decisions about us without us? Who appointed you to determine what is good for Africa? Vanderberg's voice was barely above a whisper, and it trembled as she spoke. These are preliminary discussions, preparatory work. Then, of course, we consult with African leaders. Traoré laughed, but it was a sound devoid of humor, cold, sharp, and somehow more devastating than any angry outburst could have been. Then. You've been saying then for 20 years, President Vanderberg. We'll discuss it then. We'll decide together then. We'll implement changes then. We'll share benefits then. He straightened up, his voice taking on a rhythm that suggested he was quoting from memory. When will these thens actually arrive? How many preliminary meetings must be held before African voices are included in discussions about African futures? Ingrid Vanderberg, the Dutch representative, attempted an intervention. President Traoré, these allegations are somewhat excessive. The European Union has extensive consultation mechanisms. Excessive? Traoré turned toward her with the fluid motion of a man accustomed to addressing hostile audiences. Let's discuss what might be considered excessive. The Netherlands imports approximately 500,000 tons of cocoa annually from Ghana. 90% of this cocoa is processed in Amsterdam, generating what I understand to be roughly 15 billion euros in annual revenue for your chocolate industry. The Dutch representative found herself wishing she had never spoken. Ghana's share of that 15 billion euros amounts to approximately 2 billion euros. So you generate 7 times more revenue from our raw materials than we do. He paused, allowing the mathematics to settle. Is it excessive that this ratio exists, or is it excessive that I'm mentioning it? Vanderberg had no answer. Traoré turned back to face Vanderberg, who had remained silent during this exchange. her face having gone from red to pale in the span of minutes. "President Vanderberg, you are clearly a very intelligent woman. Harvard Law graduate, Oxford doctorate, 30 years of diplomatic experience, fluent in 5 languages, author of respected works on international relations. It would be an insult to both of us to suggest that someone with your intellectual capabilities couldn't perform these simple mathematical calculations." The compliment was delivered in a tone that made it sound more like an accusation. "So, we are left with 2 possibilities. Either you genuinely don't notice these patterns, in which case one might question what qualifies you for such important positions, or you do notice them but choose to perpetuate them anyway, in which case one might question why you continue to speak of cooperation and partnership." Vanderberg, a 30-year veteran of international diplomacy who had stared down hostile negotiators from every continent, found herself unable to meet his gaze. "The European Union's intentions are genuinely, then transform intentions into concrete actions. Allow us to process our gold in our own refineries. Let us weave our cotton in our own textile mills. Permit us to manufacture our own chocolate from our own cocoa beans." He leaned forward again. "Will you support these initiatives?" Silence. "Or is this cooperation only valid as long as it maintains existing power structures and economic relationships?" Pierre Dubois made one last attempt to salvage European credibility. "President Traoré, surely you recognize the complexity of technology transfer, the infrastructure investments required, the institutional capacity that must be developed." "Technology transfer?" Traoré turned to face the French representative. "Which technology specifically?" Dubois opened his mouth to respond, but Traoré continued before he could speak. "The technology for extracting gold from our mines. Your companies already possess that technology and use it extensively on our soil. The technology for processing raw materials. That technology remains exclusively in your factories. We provide transportation and basic labor. What technology is being transferred exactly?" Dubois fell silent. "Infrastructure investments," Traoré continued, his voice taking on a tone of mock enthusiasm. "Yes, let's discuss infrastructure. Roads to transport raw materials from mines to ports. Harbors designed to accommodate bulk cargo ships. Railways optimized for moving unprocessed goods to coastal export facilities." He paused, letting the pattern become clear. "All of this infrastructure serves the extraction and export of raw materials. When we propose building processing facilities, manufacturing plants, or research centers, suddenly there are no available credits, no technology partnerships, no investment opportunities." He gestured around the room. "But for a road leading to a gold mine, there's immediately 200 million euros in development funding available." Traoré moved to the center of the table, positioning himself so that he could address the entire assembled body of European leadership simultaneously. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice taking on a formal tone that suggested he was transitioning from conversation to proclamation. "I did not come here to engage in conflict. I came to discuss realities, because the old patterns will not continue indefinitely." He paused, allowing his words to resonate through the hall. "A new generation of African leaders is emerging. We are educated in your universities, trained in your institutions, fluent in your languages, and familiar with your methods. But we are not content to perpetuate systems that were designed for our disadvantage." Several delegates were now taking notes frantically, perhaps recognizing that they were witnessing something that would require detailed reporting to their respective capitals. A new Africa is rising. An Africa that processes its own resources, determines its own economic policies, and charts its own future course. Vanderberg, gathering what remained of her composure, attempted one final counter-argument. President Traoré, while I appreciate your passion, this approach is frankly quite naive. The global economy is far more complex than these simple comparisons suggest. Naive. Traoré seemed to taste the word, finding it amusing. What, specifically, is naive about processing our own natural resources? Is it naive for China to manufacture its own products? Is it naive for India to develop its own software industry? Is it naive for South Korea to produce its own technology? He stepped closer to Vanderberg. Or does it only become naive when African nations plan their own economic development? The global economic order? Which global order? His voice had turned sharp again. The order that systematically benefits some while disadvantaging others? The order that extracts $2.5 trillion worth of natural resources from Africa annually, while ensuring that only 12% of that value remains on the continent? He struck the table with his finger, the sound echoing through the hall. That is your economic reality. Africa produces $2.5 trillion in natural resource value each year. 12%, $300 billion, stays in Africa. The remaining $2.2 trillion goes elsewhere, to countries represented in this hall. And here's what I find most remarkable. While maintaining this system that extracts $2.2 trillion annually from Africa, you simultaneously provide us with approximately $50 billion in development aid. He let that figure hang in the air for a moment. So, you're helping us with our own money, and then expecting gratitude for the gesture. Vanderberg stood up unsteadily, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. These are accusations, not constructive dialogue. Not accusations, mathematics, statistics, the data you claim to value so highly. This system of cooperation has existed for centuries. Exactly, Traoré replied, his voice gaining strength. For centuries, the same system for centuries, the same role distribution for centuries, the same double standards for centuries. He began moving toward the door, his message delivered, his point made. And you call this the natural order of things. When Traoré reached the door, he stopped and turned back to face the assembly one final time. President Vanderberg, I encourage you to use that considerable intelligence of yours to recognize a simple truth. This system is not sustainable. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. The new generation of African leaders is awakening. Our young populations are being educated in your universities and ours. Our access to technology is increasing. Our understanding of global markets is deepening. He paused for emphasis. We will not continue to play this game according to rules that were written for our disadvantage. What you must understand from these 90 seconds is this. Africa will no longer serve merely as a supplier of raw materials to fuel other economies. His hand rested on the door handle, but his attention remained focused on the room he was about to leave. If you want to be our partners, you must be willing to establish genuine partnerships, relationships based on equality, mutual benefit, and shared prosperity." He smiled, and for the first time since entering the room, there seemed to be genuine warmth in the expression. "Otherwise, we will continue on our own path, and we will succeed." The door closed behind President Ibrahim Traoré with a soft click that seemed to echo through the hall like thunder. For several minutes, no one moved. 60 of Europe's most accomplished diplomats sat in stunned silence, each processing what had just occurred in their own way. Helena Vanderberg collapsed into her chair as if her strings had been cut. In 30 years of diplomatic service, through heated negotiations and crisis meetings that determined the fates of nations, nothing had ever affected her quite like this. Everything Traoré had said was verifiable, documented, undeniable. The mathematics were correct, the historical parallels accurate, and the moral questions unavoidable. The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable, then unbearable. Finally, Hans Müller, the German representative, cleared his throat. "Helena," he said quietly, "we need to discuss what just happened here." But there was nothing to discuss, and everyone knew it. The facts spoke for themselves, and those facts had just dismantled decades of carefully constructed diplomatic language that had been designed to obscure rather than illuminate the realities of European-African economic relationships. Vanderberg's phone buzzed insistently in her jacket pocket. The caller ID showed Marcus Heinemann, one of Brussels' most influential lobbyists, and a man whose phone calls were never ignored by anyone who valued their career. "Helena," his voice was tight with barely controlled panic, "what the hell just happened in that room?" "Marcus, I can't discuss." "You don't understand," he interrupted. "We watched it live. The entire conversation was being streamed through diplomatic channels. Half of Washington saw you get dismantled by a man who wasn't even supposed to be in that building." Vanderberg's blood turned to ice. "That's impossible. These meetings are closed." "According to the information I'm receiving, this wasn't just a spontaneous visit. Last night, a mysterious transfer of $1.2 billion was made to Burkina Faso Central Bank. The source is unknown, but the timing suggests coordination at the highest levels." The room seemed to spin around Vanderberg. "There's more. The presidents of Mali, Niger, and Chad are holding an emergency meeting in Ouagadougou tomorrow. Subject: comprehensive re-evaluation of economic relationships with Europe." This wasn't just a speech, Helena. It was the opening move in a much larger game. The phone went dead, leaving Vanderberg alone in a room full of colleagues who were all staring at her with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed schadenfreude. Outside, in the corridors of European power, the whispers had already begun. Within hours, the story would be in every major newspaper, on every news broadcast, and analyzed by every think tank from London to Berlin. The 90 seconds that shook the world had accomplished exactly what they were intended to. They had started a conversation that could no longer be avoided, asked questions that demanded answers, and challenged assumptions that had governed international relations for generations. History, as they say, belongs to those brave enough to speak truth to power. On this Tuesday afternoon in Brussels, Ibrahim Traoré had done exactly that, and the world would never quite be the same. The reverberations of those 90 seconds would continue for years. Some would call it the moment when Africa found its voice in international relations. Others would characterize it as the beginning of the end of neo-colonial economic structures. Historians would debate whether it represented evolution or revolution in global power dynamics. But for Helena Vanderberg, sitting alone in that magnificent hall with its crystal chandeliers and gold-gilded ceilings, it was simply the day she learned that intelligence without wisdom, power without responsibility, and cooperation without equality were ultimately unsustainable. The flags of 27 nations still hung on the walls, but the conversations they would inspire would never again exclude the voices of those most affected by their decisions. The age of deciding for Africa without Africa was ending, and a new chapter in global diplomacy was about to begin. While Helena Vanderberg sat in stunned silence in Brussels, 8,000 kilometers away in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, a very different scene was unfolding. In a secure conference room deep within the presidential palace, President Traoré's carefully assembled team was already implementing the next phase of what would later be called Operation New Dawn. The room itself was a study in contrasts, modern technology seamlessly integrated with traditional African art. High-resolution monitors displayed real-time economic data from across the continent, while hand-carved wooden sculptures reminded everyone present of the cultural heritage they were fighting to protect and preserve. Dr. Amina Konate sat at the head of a curved desk that faced a wall of screens showing everything from commodity prices to social media sentiment analysis. At 35, she possessed credentials that would have made her a star in any international financial institution. MIT Economics Doctorate, 10 years at Goldman Sachs where she had specialized in emerging markets, and a photographic memory for economic data that had earned her the nickname the calculator among her colleagues. But Dr. Konate had chosen a different path. 3 years earlier, she had walked away from a 7-figure salary in Manhattan to return to her homeland and join President Traoré's economic advisory team. Her colleagues in New York had called her crazy. Today, watching the feeds from Brussels, she knew she had made the right choice. "Phase 1 is complete," she announced to the assembled team. "The president's performance in Brussels exceeded our most optimistic projections. Social media engagement is through the roof. International news outlets are scrambling to provide context. And, most importantly, the European response is exactly what we anticipated." Next to her sat Kwame Asante, a 26-year-old computer prodigy whose baby face and gentle demeanor concealed a mind that could penetrate the most sophisticated digital security systems in the world. MIT had recruited him at 16. The CIA had tried to recruit him at 20. He had turned them all down to work for Africa's digital independence. "Dr. K," he said, using the nickname that everyone on the team had adopted, "we've successfully infiltrated 17 different European diplomatic communication networks. The panic in Brussels is extraordinary. They're calling emergency meetings, activating crisis management protocols, and, most tellingly, they're trying to figure out how much we actually know about their operations." On the screen in front of them, social media feeds showed the Brussels speech spreading like wildfire. The hashtag #AfricaRising had generated over 300,000 tweets in the first 4 hours. YouTube views were approaching 500,000 and climbing rapidly. More importantly, the conversations weren't just happening in Africa. Young people in London, Paris, Berlin, and Rome were sharing the video and asking uncomfortable questions about their own government's policies. Dr. Konate pressed a button on her console, and a section of the wall slid back to reveal a sophisticated video conferencing setup. The screen flickered to life, showing a man in an expensive suit sitting in what appeared to be a corporate boardroom halfway around the world. Chen Wei-ming, CEO of China's largest technology and infrastructure company, looked like he hadn't slept in 24 hours. His tie was slightly askew, his usually perfect hair showed signs of hurried travel, and there was an intensity in his eyes that suggested he understood the magnitude of what was happening. "Dr. Konate," he said in English that carried only the faintest trace of an accent, "President Traoré's performance in Brussels has accelerated our timeline considerably. Beijing has reviewed his proposals, and I'm authorized to make commitments that were originally planned for next year." Dr. Konate leaned forward. This was the conversation she had been preparing for since joining Traoré's team. "We're listening, Mr. Chen. Burkina Faso's gold processing capacity. China is prepared to provide complete technology transfer for a state-of-the-art refinery capable of processing 200 tons annually. Investment commitment, $800 million for Phase 1, with additional funding available as production scales up." The room fell silent. This was more than they had dared to hope for. Chen continued. "Cotton processing. We're prepared to establish textile manufacturing facilities capable of handling 300,000 tons of raw cotton annually. This would make Burkina Faso the largest textile producer in West Africa within 5 years." Kwame whistled softly. The numbers were staggering. "But that's just the beginning," Chen said, and something in his tone suggested that the real surprise was yet to come. "Beijing has approved the African Industrial Development Initiative. Total investment across 15 African nations over 10 years, $50 billion. Dr. Konate's calculator mind was already running projections. "What's the catch?" Chen smiled, the first genuine emotion he had shown during the conversation. "There is no catch, Dr. Konate. China learned long ago that prosperity is not a zero-sum game. A wealthier Africa is a better trading partner, a more stable ally, and ultimately more valuable to Chinese interests than a continent that exists only to supply raw materials." He paused, then added, "Besides, President Traoré just demonstrated that the old model is no longer sustainable. Europe can continue living in the 19th century if they choose. China prefers to invest in the 21st. As the call with Chen concluded, Kwame turned to a different set of screens that showed encrypted communication intercepts from across Europe. His fingers flew across keyboards with the speed and precision of a concert pianist, decrypting messages that European intelligence services believed were secure. "Dr. K," he said, excitement creeping into his voice, "you need to see this." The main screen filled with what appeared to be a transcript of a phone conversation between Helena Vanderberg and someone identified only as Asset Blackbird. "This is from 30 minutes ago," Kwame explained. "Vanderberg is reporting directly to someone in European intelligence. The conversation suggests that today's events were anticipated by some elements within the European security apparatus." Dr. Konate read the transcript carefully, her expression growing darker with each line. "They knew he was coming," she said finally. "This wasn't a surprise visit. They allowed him into that building." "It gets worse," Kwame continued. "We've intercepted communications suggesting that European intelligence has been monitoring African leadership communications for months. They may know more about our continental coordination efforts than we realized." This was troubling news, but Dr. Konate had spent years in the corridors of international finance. She understood that information warfare was as important as economic strategy. "What's our countermove?" Kwame's smile was sharp. "We've been monitoring their monitoring. Every communication they've intercepted, we have records of. Every African leader they've been watching, we've been watching them watch. And some of the information they think they have about our operations is, shall we say, creatively edited." On another screen, feeds from European news networks showed a coordinated response that had clearly been planned in advance. The BBC was running a story about African economic instability and the dangers of populist leadership. France 24 was broadcasting an analysis titled "The Challenges of Rapid Development in Post-Colonial Africa." Deutsche Welle had produced a documentary-style piece on the complex realities of international trade relationships. Dr. Konate watched the coverage with professional interest. The messaging was subtle but consistent. President Traoré was portrayed as charismatic but naive, his arguments compelling but oversimplified, his goals admirable but unrealistic. "Classic," she murmured. "They can't attack the facts, so they attack the messenger's credibility and the feasibility of alternatives." But the social media response was telling a different story. Young Europeans were sharing the Brussels video with comments that ranged from supportive to outright angry at their own governments. University students were organizing discussion groups to examine European trade relationships with Africa. Environmental activists were connecting dots between resource extraction and climate change. Most tellingly, African diaspora communities across Europe were mobilizing. In London's Brixton, Paris's 18th arrondissement, and Berlin's Wedding District, community leaders were organizing meetings to discuss how they could support the new African initiative. Dr. Konate's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from the Central Bank of Burkina Faso. The governor's message was brief but alarming. European banks are freezing credit lines. Trade finance for gold exports has been suspended. They're moving faster than expected. This was the response she had anticipated, but the speed was concerning. European financial institutions were attempting to strangle Burkina Faso's economy before alternative arrangements could be established. "Kwame," she called across the room, "initiate Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was a contingency plan that had taken 2 years to develop. Within minutes, Kwame had established secure connections to central banks in China, Russia, India, and Brazil. Alternative credit lines that had been negotiated in secret were activated. Trade finance arrangements that bypassed European institutions were confirmed. Dr. K, Kwame reported, we're receiving confirmation from Shanghai. The Bank of China is prepared to handle all gold trade finance at rates more favorable than European institutions were offering. Moscow is confirming platinum and copper arrangements. New Delhi is establishing textile trade credit lines. Brasilia is offering agricultural commodity financing. Within 3 hours of President Traoré's speech in Brussels, Burkina Faso had effectively decoupled its international trade from European financial institutions. The secure communication system that connected African presidential palaces across the continent had been quietly buzzing with activity since the Brussels speech ended. President Traoré had spent years building relationships with his counterparts, and today those relationships were paying dividends. Dr. Konate activated the multi-party video conference system, and screens around the room filled with the faces of Africa's most powerful leaders. President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa appeared alongside Presidents William Ruto of Kenya, Bola Tinubu of Nigeria, Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana, and Abdel Fattah el-Sisi of Egypt. "Ibrahim," President Ramaphosa began without preamble, "that was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen in international diplomacy." President Traoré, who had returned from Brussels an hour earlier, smiled tiredly. "Perhaps both, Cyril, but necessary." "The European response has been swift," President Ruto reported from Nairobi. "We're seeing coordinated pressure across multiple fronts. Trade agreements are being reviewed, aid packages are being reassessed, and there are hints of diplomatic isolation if we support your initiative." Which added President Tinubu from Abuja, makes it clear that Ibrahim struck a nerve. They're not responding like people who believe their system is just and sustainable. They're responding like people who know it isn't. President Akufo-Addo's face showed the strain of someone who had been fielding angry phone calls from European capitals. Ghana has received 3 separate calls from Brussels in the past 4 hours. They want assurances that Ghana will not follow Burkina Faso's example. "What did you tell them?" Dr. Konate asked. "That Ghana will always act in Ghana's best interests," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They didn't seem satisfied with that answer. As the African leaders continued their discussion, Kwame signaled for attention from his position at the intelligence console. "I'm intercepting communications between Brussels and Washington," he reported. "The Americans are taking a very different position than the Europeans." He activated an audio feed that played a recorded conversation between what appeared to be high-level American and European officials. "Your African problem is becoming our opportunity," an American voice said. "If Europe wants to maintain 19th-century relationships with a 21st-century continent, that's your choice. But don't expect American support for economic arrangements that make no sense in the modern world." A European voice, heavily accented, responded with obvious frustration. "You cannot seriously suggest that African nations are capable of managing complex industrial operations without European oversight." "I'm suggesting," the American replied coldly, "that underestimating African capability has been Europe's mistake for the past century. We don't intend to repeat it." Dr. Konate paused the recording. "Washington is positioning itself as the reasonable alternative to European obstinacy. They're playing a longer game." President Traoré nodded thoughtfully. "Which means we have more leverage than Europe realizes, but less time than we hoped." While the continental leaders discussed high-level strategy, a different kind of conversation was happening on university campuses across Africa. The Brussels speech had gone viral among young Africans, but more importantly, it had sparked organizing efforts that went beyond social media engagement. At the University of Lagos, engineering students were designing plans for local manufacturing facilities that could process Nigerian crude oil into refined products. At Makerere University in Uganda, economics students were developing models for intra-African trade that would reduce dependence on European markets. At the University of Cape Town, computer science students were building blockchain-based systems for transparent resource extraction monitoring. The generational divide was stark. Older Africans, particularly those who had lived through the independence movements of the 1960s, were cautiously optimistic but concerned about European retaliation. Younger Africans, educated and connected to global networks, were energized and impatient for change. Dr. Konate had been monitoring these developments through social media analysis and direct communication with university networks across the continent. The data was encouraging. This wasn't just political rhetoric resonating with young people, it was inspiring concrete technical and economic innovation. "The demographic shift is in our favor," she reported to the assembled leaders. 60% of Africa's population is under 25. They're educated, connected, and tired of being told that African solutions to African problems are unrealistic. In Brussels, the emergency session that had been called immediately after President Traoré's departure was still ongoing 6 hours later. The European Council building, which had seemed so imposing that afternoon, now felt like a fortress under siege. Helena Vanderberg, despite her personal humiliation, remained the European Union's foremost expert on African affairs. The other representatives needed her analysis, even if they questioned her handling of the situation. "The intelligence reports are clear," she said.
addressing a room that now included foreign ministers from major European nations who had flown in for the crisis session. This was not a spontaneous outburst. President Traoré's speech was part of a coordinated strategy that involves significant financial backing from non-European sources. She activated a presentation that displayed financial flows, communication intercepts, and intelligence assessments that painted a picture of continental coordination that went far beyond what European leadership had anticipated. French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian leaned forward. "What are you recommending?" Vanderberg's response revealed the depth of European panic. "We have 48 hours to present a counteroffer that demonstrates European commitment to genuine partnership, or we risk losing Africa to Chinese influence for the next generation." The European response, when it came, was unprecedented in its scope and speed. Within 36 hours of President Traoré's Brussels speech, the European Union announced the new Partnership for African Development, a Euro 100 billion initiative that promised technology transfer, industrial development support, and most significantly, joint ownership of processing facilities for African raw materials. The announcement was made simultaneously in Brussels, Paris, Berlin, and Rome, with European leaders appearing via satellite link to address African audiences directly. The messaging was carefully crafted to acknowledge the validity of President Traoré's arguments while positioning Europe as the natural partner for African development. But the offer came with conditions that revealed European intentions. Technology transfer would be gradual and conditional on stability metrics. Industrial development would require European management partnerships. Joint ownership meant European companies would maintain controlling interests in processing facilities. Dr. Konaté analyzed the European proposal with the cold precision that had made her legendary in international finance circles. Her assessment was devastating. This is the same relationship structure with better marketing. They're offering to let us be junior partners in our own development. President Traoré's response was delivered not through diplomatic channels, but via a live-streamed address to the African Union, with simultaneous translation into Arabic, French, English, Portuguese, and Swahili. "Our European partners have made an impressive offer," he said, standing before a backdrop of African flags. "They are prepared to invest 100 billion euros in African development over 10 years. This represents a significant improvement over current arrangements." He paused, allowing the apparent praise to settle before delivering his analysis. However, the terms of this partnership remain fundamentally unchanged. European companies would maintain controlling interests in facilities built on African soil, using African resources, and employing African workers. The 100 billion euro investment would generate an estimated 500 billion euros in returns over the same period, with 80% of those returns flowing to European shareholders. The mathematics were stark and undeniable. "Africa does not reject partnership," President Traoré continued. "We reject subordination disguised as partnership." He gestured to a map of Africa that appeared behind him, showing proposed industrial development zones across the continent. "The African Development Consortium, supported by our global partners, is prepared to invest $200 billion over the same 10-year period in genuinely African-owned industrial development. These facilities will be owned by African nations, managed by African professionals, and operated for the benefit of African peoples." The camera zoomed in on his face as he delivered the most important part of his message. This is not anti-European. European companies will be welcome to participate as suppliers, customers, and technical partners, but they will participate as equals, not as colonial masters operating under new names. The response to President Traoré's counterproposal revealed how dramatically the global balance of power had shifted in recent decades. Within hours, official statements of support arrived from Beijing, Moscow, New Delhi, and Brasilia. The non-aligned movement, dormant since the end of the Cold War, suddenly found new relevance as a platform for African assertiveness. More surprising was the response from Washington. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken released a statement that carefully avoided taking sides, while emphasizing America's commitment to mutually beneficial partnerships with all developing economies. The subtext was clear. The United States would not automatically support European positions in this new confrontation. Within financial markets, the reaction was swift and telling. African currencies strengthened against the euro. Commodity futures prices spiked as traders anticipated disruptions in established supply chains. Most significantly, investment flows toward African infrastructure projects increased dramatically as global capital sought to position itself for the new reality. Perhaps most surprising was the response from within European corporate circles. Several major companies that had built their business models around African resource extraction began quietly reaching out to Dr. Konaté's team to discuss alternative arrangements. The CEO of one of Europe's largest mining companies, speaking on condition of anonymity, explained the corporate perspective. "We've known for years that the current model was unsustainable. African governments were becoming more sophisticated, their populations more educated, and their expectations higher. We were waiting for political cover to negotiate new arrangements." These companies had run their own projections and reached conclusions that aligned closely with President Traoré's analysis. Genuine partnerships that allowed African nations to capture more value from their resources would be more profitable in the long term than extractive relationships that generated constant political tension and instability. The corporate outreach efforts were conducted through intermediaries and back channels, but they represented a significant crack in European solidarity. 3 weeks after President Traoré's speech, Helena Vanderberg submitted her resignation as President of the European Council. Her farewell address was brief but revealing. The events of recent weeks have forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our relationships with African nations. President Traoré's critique, while delivered in an unconventional manner, was fundamentally accurate in its assessment of existing power imbalances. She paused, looking directly into the camera. "Europe has a choice. We can adapt to a world where African nations are equal partners in global commerce, or we can cling to arrangements that were designed for a different era. The first path offers sustainable prosperity for all parties. The second path leads to irrelevance." Her replacement, announced the following day, was a surprise. Dr. Emma Larsson, a Swedish development economist who had spent 15 years working for the World Bank in Africa and had published extensively on sustainable development partnerships. Dr. Larsson's first official statement suggested a dramatic shift in European thinking. The European Union is prepared to engage with African nations on the basis of genuine equality and mutual benefit. The old paradigms have failed, and new approaches are necessary. 6 months after the speech that changed everything, President Traoré stood in the same spot where he had confronted European leadership, but the context was entirely different. The European Council building was hosting the first Continental Partnership Summit, bringing together African heads of state, European leaders, and representatives from China, India, Brazil, and the United States. The mahogany table around which so many colonial-era decisions had been made was gone, replaced by a circular arrangement that symbolized the equality of all participants. The 27 European flags still hung on the walls, but they were now accompanied by flags from all 54 African nations. Dr. Konate, now serving as Director General of the African Development Consortium, presented the results of the first 6 months of the new approach. Gold processing facilities are under construction in Ghana, Burkina Faso, and Mali. Cotton textile manufacturing has begun operations in Benin and Chad. Cocoa processing plants are operational in Côte d'Ivoire and Nigeria. She clicked to the next slide, showing economic indicators that told a story of transformation. African GDP growth has accelerated to 8% annually. Youth unemployment has decreased by 15%. Most importantly, the value-added component of African exports has increased from 12% to 35% in just 6 months. The European representatives in the room listened with expressions that ranged from resignation to genuine interest in the new possibilities. History would record that the transformation of African-European economic relationships didn't happen overnight. The process required years of complex negotiations, significant investments in education and infrastructure, and careful management of competing interests from global powers. But historians would also note that the change began with 90 seconds of uncomfortable truth spoken in a room where such truths had been avoided for decades. President Ibrahim Traoré, asked years later about that afternoon in Brussels, would reflect, "Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that make everyone uncomfortable. Growth requires discomfort. Justice requires confronting injustice, and genuine partnership requires the courage to abandon relationships based on dominance and subordination." Helena Vanderberg, who had transitioned to a career in academic research on post-colonial economics, would write in her memoirs, "I entered that room believing that intelligence and experience gave me advantages in any negotiation. I learned that moral clarity and mathematical accuracy are more powerful than any diplomatic technique." The Brussels confrontation, as it came to be known, was studied in diplomatic academies, business schools, and political science programs around the world. But perhaps its most important legacy was simpler. It demonstrated that change was possible, that power relationships that seemed permanent could be challenged, and that the courage to speak truth to power could literally change the world. The 90 seconds that shook the world had become the foundation for a new century of African development, European adaptation, and global partnership based on equality rather than exploitation. And it all began with one man, in one room, speaking truths that everyone knew but no one had dared to say.